In October 1844, a South Carolina plantation owner walked into his barn at midnight and found his 19-year-old son naked with 3 enslaved women. What happened next shocked even the brutal standards of antebellum society. The father didn't punish his son privately. He didn't sell the women away. Instead, he forced a public spectacle that would haunt a small town for generations. A triple wedding ceremony in the town square where his white son was legally married to all 3 black women simultaneously, in front of hundreds of witnesses who were forbidden from looking away. This is Buried Truths, where we uncover suppressed slavery history from primary court records and archived testimonies. I'm telling you about the Hartwell family scandal today, but if you're new here, understand this. We've documented over 40 cases of suppressed resistance and hidden horrors that textbooks won't teach. Subscribe right now so you don't miss the next buried truth. Every week, another documented story from primary sources. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's dive into one of the most psychologically twisted punishment spectacles in South Carolina history. Colonel Benjamin Hartwell owned Riverside Plantation in Edgefield County, South Carolina, one of the state's most productive cotton operations with over 120 enslaved workers. He was known throughout the region as a strict Presbyterian who enforced rigid moral codes on both his family and his enslaved population. Public church attendance was mandatory. Sexual impropriety was punished with brutal efficiency. The colonel had built his reputation on the appearance of godly order and absolute control. His son, William Hartwell, had returned home in spring 1844 after 2 years at South Carolina College in Columbia. William was 19 years old, educated in classical literature and theology, expected to eventually inherit Riverside and continue the family's standing in Edgefield society. But William had developed interests during his college years that his father found deeply troubling. Specifically, he'd begun questioning the theological justifications for slavery and had written essays suggesting that enslaved people possessed souls equal to white people. The colonel dismissed this as youthful philosophical confusion that hard work and responsibility would cure. He put William in charge of overseeing the plantation's evening operations, checking that livestock were secured, tools stored, quarters locked down for the night. It was meant to instill discipline and give William hands-on experience with plantation management. If you're already hooked by where this is heading, do me a favor. Subscribe to Buried Truths right now, because what you're about to hear gets more psychologically complex than you're expecting. We document these stories every single week from court records and archived testimonies. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell notification so YouTube actually shows you our next episode. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next week. What the colonel didn't know was that William had been using these evening duties for a very different purpose. Over the course of 5 months, William had developed relationships with 3 enslaved women on the plantation: Ruth, age 22, Grace, age 19, and Dinah, age 24. The relationships had started with William bringing them books to read, a forbidden act since teaching enslaved people literacy was illegal in South Carolina. But it had evolved into something far more complicated. William had been meeting all 3 women regularly in the barn after dark. The nature of these relationships is documented in testimony that emerged later, and here's where the historical record gets murky in ways that matter. Were these consensual relationships, as William claimed in his later testimony, or were they coerced by the fundamental power imbalance of slavery, as the women's community testified? The truth is that under slavery, true consent was impossible. William had absolute power over these women's lives regardless of his personal feelings or philosophical objections to slavery. That context is crucial. What we know for certain is that the relationships were ongoing, involved all 3 women simultaneously, and had been kept secret from the colonel for 5 months. William later testified that he'd been teaching them to read, discussing theology and philosophy, and had convinced himself that his relationships with Ruth, Grace, and Dinah were somehow different from the typical sexual exploitation of enslaved women by white men, that his enlightened views made it consensual rather than coercive. This is the kind of delusion that educated men often constructed to justify their actions while maintaining their self-image as moral. William wasn't some ignorant overseer. He was a college-educated man who'd read Enlightenment philosophy and Christian theology, and he'd convinced himself that power dynamics didn't apply to him because his intentions were different. On October 14, 1844, Colonel Hartwell returned early from a trip to Charleston. Something had made him suspicious. perhaps gossip from other enslaved workers, perhaps inconsistencies in William's reports, perhaps just paternal instinct that his son was hiding something. Around midnight, the colonel walked quietly to the barn and opened the door without warning. He found William naked with all 3 women in the hay loft. The scene was exactly what it appeared to be. The colonel's reaction was immediate and volcanic, not because sexual exploitation of enslaved women was unusual on plantations, but because his own son had been caught, because it involved 3 women simultaneously, and perhaps most importantly, because William's behavior threatened the moral authority the colonel had built his reputation upon. Pause here for a moment. If you're wondering how this gets more twisted, we're only getting started. This is exactly why Buried Truths exists, to uncover suppressed history where the moral complexity is so uncomfortable that it stayed buried for over a century and a half. Every detail I'm telling you comes from court depositions, church records, and testimony filed in Edgefield County Archives. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because next week we're covering a Virginia plantation where an enslaved man was given the choice between freedom and staying to protect his family. And what he chose will break your heart. Subscribe so you're here for it. Hit that bell icon for notifications. Now back to what Colonel Hartwell decided to do with his son and 3 enslaved women. The colonel ordered William and the 3 women to dress and follow him to the main house. For the rest of that night, he interrogated all 4 separately. The testimony that survives from later legal proceedings reveals what he discovered: the relationships had been ongoing for 5 months. William had been teaching the women to read using his college textbooks. He'd been conducting religious discussions with them about the equality of souls before God. And he'd apparently promised Ruth, Grace, and Dinah that he would eventually find a way to free them. For Colonel Hartwell, this was worse than simple sexual exploitation. His son hadn't just been using enslaved women for physical gratification, which, while officially frowned upon, was quietly tolerated throughout plantation society. William had been treating them as intellectual and spiritual equals. He'd been educating them illegally. He'd been undermining the entire ideological foundation of slavery by suggesting they deserved freedom. And worst of all, from the colonel's perspective, William seemed to have genuine affection for these women, rather than simply viewing them as available property. The colonel spent 3 days deciding how to handle the situation. He couldn't simply punish William privately and sell the women away. Too many people knew about the discovery now. House slaves had heard the midnight confrontation. The women's families in the quarters knew they'd been summoned to the main house. Rumors were already circulating. If the colonel handled this quietly, it would look like weakness, like he couldn't control his own son, like the moral authority he'd built his reputation on was hypocritical. So Colonel Benjamin Hartwell made a decision that contemporary observers described as either brilliant punishment or complete insanity. He announced that his son William would marry all 3 women in a public ceremony in Edgefield Town Square, legally binding marriages conducted by a Presbyterian minister, with the entire town required to attend and witness. This was unprecedented. South Carolina law didn't recognize marriages between white people and enslaved people. Such marriages were literally illegal. But the colonel had thought this through. He announced that he was first granting manumission, legal freedom, to Ruth, Grace, and Dinah. Once they were legally free black women rather than enslaved property, the marriages wouldn't technically be illegal, though they would still violate every social norm and anti-miscegenation custom that white South Carolina society held sacred. The colonel's logic was twisted but calculated. He would humiliate his son publicly by forcing him to marry the women he'd been caught with, destroying William's prospects of ever being accepted in white society. He would satisfy the enslaved community's anger by freeing the 3 women and giving them legal status as William's wives. He would demonstrate his own moral authority by showing he enforced consequences even on his own son. And he would create a spectacle so shocking that it would warn every other young white man in the region about the consequences of treating enslaved women as equals. William protested. He argued that public humiliation wasn't necessary, that he'd be willing to marry one of the women privately, that a triple wedding spectacle was cruel to Ruth, Grace, and Dinah. But the colonel was immovable. The ceremony would happen publicly, or William would be permanently disowned and disinherited with nothing. The 3 women would be freed and married to William, or they'd be sold immediately to the Deep South and separated from their families forever. It was an impossible choice designed to guarantee maximum suffering for everyone involved. Before we get to what happened in that town square, I need to pause and remind you, this is documented history from church records and court depositions filed in Edgefield County, South Carolina. This actually happened. And if stories like this shock you, you need to subscribe to Buried Truths, because we uncover suppressed history like this every single week from primary sources. Next week's episode covers an enslaved man forced to choose between freedom and family, and his choice is heartbreaking. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. Turn on notifications. We're building the largest archive of buried slavery truths on YouTube, and every subscriber helps these stories reach more people. Now let's talk about the wedding that traumatized a South Carolina town. On October 24, 1844, Colonel Hartwell made good on his threat. He sent word throughout Edgefield that attendance at the ceremony was mandatory for all white families and all enslaved people from surrounding plantations who could be spared from work. He wanted maximum witnesses. He wanted this seared into community memory. The town square was packed with over 400 people. Church records describe the scene. William Hartwell standing in formal wedding attire looking pale and sick, Ruth, Grace, and Dinah dressed in simple but clean dresses provided by the colonel. Reverend Thomas McClendon standing before them with a Bible, looking deeply uncomfortable with what he'd been ordered to do, and Colonel Hartwell standing to the side with a shotgun across his chest, making it clear this ceremony would proceed with or without cooperation. Reverend McClendon conducted 3 separate wedding ceremonies consecutively. First William to Ruth, then William to Grace, then William to Dinah. Each ceremony used the traditional Presbyterian marriage liturgy. Till death do you part. What God has joined together let no man put asunder. The whole theological framework of Christian marriage applied to a situation that mocked every principle it represented. The white families in attendance stood in rigid silence. This was horrifying to them not because they cared about the enslaved women, but because it represented a collapse of social order. A white man marrying black women, even free black women, was an abomination to their racial worldview. Some families left before the ceremony ended despite the colonel's orders to stay. Others covered their children's eyes as if witnessing racial mixing would spiritually contaminate them. The enslaved people forced to attend had more complicated reactions. Some later testified that they felt triumph seeing 3 women freed and given legal status as wives, a protection that slavery almost never provided. Others felt horror watching what they saw as a cruel spectacle, designed to humiliate everyone involved while letting the colonel maintain his authority. Still others focused on the fact that Ruth, Grace, and Dinah were being permanently separated from their families and communities by this forced marriage, even though they were now technically free, and Ruth, Grace, and Dinah themselves. Their testimony from later years, yes, they survived long enough to give testimony, reveals women trapped in impossible moral territory. They understood they were being used as instruments of punishment against William. They understood their freedom came with permanent exile from their families and communities. They understood that William's love, or respect, for them hadn't been enough to protect them from his father's power. But they also understood that legal marriage status and manumission papers gave them protections that almost no other enslaved women would ever possess. When the ceremonies concluded, Colonel Hartwell announced the final element of his punishment. William was no longer welcome at Riverside Plantation. He was permanently disowned and disinherited. The colonel was granting him a small plot of land at the edge of the county, 40 acres of poor soil that had never been successfully cultivated, and $200. William would live there with his 3 wives and survive however he could. But he would never inherit Riverside, never be welcomed in Edgefield society, and never bear the Hartwell name with honor again. William Hartwell and his 3 wives moved to that marginal land in November 1844. They built a small cabin and attempted to farm the poor soil. The isolation was total. White society rejected them for racial mixing, and the black community couldn't fully accept them because William represented the oppressor class despite his current exile. They existed in social limbo, belonging nowhere. The historical record gets fragmentary after the forced marriages, but here's what we can piece together from census records, court documents, and later testimony. William and his 3 wives survived on that marginal land for 6 years. Ruth bore him 2 children. Grace had 1 child. Dinah remained childless. The children were legally free because their mothers had been manumitted before marriage, but they grew up in the same social isolation as their parents, rejected by both white and black communities. In 1850, Colonel Hartwell died. His will pointedly excluded William from any inheritance. leaving Riverside Plantation to a nephew instead. But with the colonel's death, some of the social pressure that had kept William isolated began to ease. William began attending Quaker meetings in a neighboring county, the only religious community that would accept his interracial family. The Quakers documented his attendance and later recorded testimony from him, Ruth Grace, and Dina about the 1844 forced marriages. That Quaker testimony, filed in their meeting records and later archived, is where most of our detailed information about this case comes from. William expressed profound regret not for his relationships with the three women, but for how his naivete about power dynamics had placed them in an impossible situation. He acknowledged that his education and philosophical beliefs had made him think he was somehow exempt from slavery's coercive power structure, and that this delusion had ultimately led to their public humiliation. Ruth Grace and Dina's testimony is more complex. They described William as someone who genuinely cared for them, but whose privilege had blinded him to the reality that no relationship could be truly consensual within slavery's power dynamics. They described the forced marriages as simultaneously emancipatory and traumatic, freedom granted as punishment rather than justice. They described their lives after 1844 as isolated but legally protected in ways that their enslaved relatives could never experience. By 1860 census records, William Hartwell was listed as a struggling farmer living with 3 colored wives and 5 mixed-race children. The listing itself was unusual. Census takers typically didn't record interracial marriages because they were socially invisible. The fact that William's situation was documented suggests it remained notorious enough that officials felt compelled to record the anomaly. The Civil War interrupted the historical record. When Edgefield County records resume in the late 1860s, William Hartwell's property had been abandoned. Family oral history recorded by black descendants in the 1930s WPA Slave Narrative Project suggests that Ruth Grace and Dinah eventually left William and moved to a black community in North Carolina where their mixed-race children could attend Freedmen's Bureau schools. William disappeared from records entirely after 1863, likely died during the war or its aftermath. So what do we do with a story like this? It doesn't fit comfortable categories. Colonel Hartwell freed 3 enslaved women, but as an act of punishment and control, not justice. William Hartwell claimed to love and respect Ruth Grace and Dina, but his privilege made him blind to how slavery's power dynamics made true consent impossible. The 3 women gained legal freedom and protection, but through public humiliation and permanent exile from their families. The forced triple wedding was simultaneously an act of manumission, a spectacle of punishment, a violation of consent, a grant of legal rights, a racist humiliation, and a demonstration of absolute patriarchal power. It was all of these things at once. Slavery created conditions where such moral complexity could exist, where freedom could be weaponized, where love could coexist with coercion, where legal rights could be granted through cruelty. The white community of Edgefield remembered this story as a cautionary tale about the consequences of racial mixing and challenging social order. The black community remembered it as an example of how even manumission could be twisted into another form of control. Ruth, Grace, and Dina's descendants remembered it as a complicated family origin story that defied simple interpretation. And here's what's most important. This story was suppressed for over a century not because it was too brutal, but because it was too complicated. It challenged simple narratives about slavery. It showed white men who claimed to oppose slavery while still exploiting enslaved women. It showed manumission used as punishment rather than liberation. It showed how freedom itself could be weaponized within slavery's power structure. These ambiguities made it uncomfortable for historians who wanted clean narratives of oppressor and oppressed. But suppressed history doesn't disappear. It survives in church records, Quaker meeting minutes, court depositions, census anomalies, and oral traditions passed down through families who lived these complexities. Our job at Buried Truths is to dig through those archives and bring these stories back into light. Not to provide comfortable answers, but to sit with the uncomfortable moral territory that slavery created. That's the truth they tried to bury. The forced triple wedding in Edgefield Town Square, South Carolina, 1844, documented in church records, Quaker testimony, and court depositions that historians ignored for over 150 years, and now impossible to ignore. This is Buried Truths. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. We uncover stories like this every single week from primary sources, church records, plantation journals, court testimonies that reveal the complex moral reality of slavery that textbooks simplify or erase entirely. Next week, We're covering the Virginia plantation where an enslaved man named Solomon was offered immediate freedom on one condition. He had to leave behind his wife and 3 children who would remain enslaved. What Solomon chose, and what happened to his family afterward, is one of the most heartbreaking impossible choices I've ever documented. You need to hear that story. Subscribe to Buried Truths right now. Hit that red subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell so YouTube actually shows you when we post next week. We're building the largest archive of suppressed, resistant stories and hidden horrors on YouTube. And every single subscription helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. We post every week. Every story is documented with primary sources linked in the description. Every story challenges simple narratives and forces us to sit with uncomfortable complexity. That's what Buried Truths require. The courage to look at history without flinching, even when it doesn't provide the easy answers we want. If this story made you think, if it challenged your assumptions, if it made you angry or heartbroken or confused, that's exactly right. That means you're engaging with history honestly. Now subscribe so you can do that every single week with us. This is Buried Truths. These are the stories they tried to erase. We're making sure they never disappear again. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and I'll see you next week with another truth they buried. Solomon's impossible choice between freedom and family. Don't let these stories stay buried. Subscribe to Buried Truths. See you next week.